Welcome to my channel. This is Captain Binoy Varakil, Assistant Professor, Department of English, St. Joseph's College, Devgiri, Kozhikode, Kerala. We continue our discussion of On the Sublime by Longinus, and this is the fourth lecture in this series. In the previous lectures, we looked at the authorship of the treatise on the Sublime. We looked at who Longinus is. We also looked at the concept of sublimity, and we discussed chapter 7, which is titled The True Sublime, in detail in the previous lectures. And now we go forward to the next chapter, that is chapter number 8, and this is lecture number 4. And in chapter number 8, Longinus talks to us about different sources of sublimity. We know what sublimity is. Sublimity is the distinct and excellent kind of writing which can transport the readers or listeners to ecstasy. And according to Longinus, there are 5 sources for sublimity. Sublimity result from 5 sources, and he tells us all the 5 sources of sublimity in chapter 8, and we shall look at all the 5 sources. Before that, we'll go for a reading of chapter 8, because chapter 8 is for detailed discussion, and after a reading of chapter 8, we will just come to a conclusion of all the 5 sources of sublimity. 5 sources of sublimity, chapter 8. It may be said that there are 5 particularly fruitful sources of the grand style, and beneath these 5 there lies as a common foundation the command of language, without which nothing worthwhile can be done. The first and most important is the ability to form grand conceptions, as I have explained in my work on Xenophon. Second comes the stimulus of powerful and inspired emotion. These 2 elements of the sublime are very largely innate, while the remainder are the product of art, that is, the proper formation of the 2 types of figures of thought and figures of speech, together with noble diction, which in turn may be resolved into the choice of words and the use of imagery and elaborated language. The 5th source of grandeur, which embraces all those I have already mentioned, is dignified and elevated word arrangement. We must consider then what is involved under each of these heads, with a preliminary reminder that Caecilius has left out of account some of the 5 divisions, one of them obviously being that which relates to emotion. Now, if he thought that these 2 things, sublimity and emotion, were the same thing, and that they were essentially bound up with each other, he is mistaken. For some emotions can be found that are mean and not in the least sublime, such as pity, grief, and fear. And on the other hand, many sublime passages convey no emotion, such as, among countless examples, Homer's daring lines about the Allodae. Keenly they strove to set Ossa upon Olympus, and upon Ossa the forest-clad Pelion, that they might mount up to heaven, and still greater conception that follows. And this would they have accomplished. With the orators, again, their eulogies, ceremonial addresses, and display speeches contain touches of majesty and grandeur at every point, but as a rule lack emotion. Thus, emotional speakers are the least effective eulogists, while, on the other hand, those who excel are panegyrists avoid emotionalism. But if Caecilius believed that emotion contributes nothing at all to the sublime, and for this reason considered it not worth mentioning, once again he was making a very serious mistake, for I would confidently maintain that nothing contributes so decisively to grandeur as noble emotion in the right setting, when filled as it were with frenzy and enthusiasm. It breathes a kind of divine inspiration into the speaker's words. So, I was reading from chapter 8 of Longinus on the Sublime, and in this chapter, Longinus speaks to us about the sources of Sublime. And now we have to just consolidate all the sources of Sublime. So, the sources of the Sublime are of two kinds. Please understand the fact that there are 5 important sources for the Sublime or Sublimity. Sublimity, that is excellent and distinct kind of writing, result from 5 sources, and these 5 sources can be broadly classified into 2, and they are inborn sources and number 2, acquirable sources. What do we understand by this? From this we can understand that any poet or any artist or writer, okay, he may just have 2 kinds of sources. Number 1, inborn sources. An author, a writer, will have some talents, some faculties innately by birth, and all that is known as inborn sources. And maybe there are of course other sources that would lead to sublimity, and these sources writers can inculcate by training, by practice, by education. So in short, Longinus is of the opinion that there are 2 main sources for sublimity. Number 1, inborn sources, and number 2, acquirable sources. Sources we get by birth and sources we acquire by training or education. And it is just termed as sources, natural sources and artificial sources. Both nature and art, says Longinus, contribute to sublimity in literature. Both nature means whatever we get by birth, by nature, and art refers to by education, by training. Longinus finds 5 principal sources of the sublime, the first 2 of which are largely the gifts of nature, and the remaining 3 are gifts of art. So, what are the inborn sources of sublimity? The inborn sources of sublimity are grandeur of thought, great thoughts. Number 2, capacity for strong emotion. So these are 2 of the sources we get by birth. Some people have great thoughts, and some people have, of course, capacity for strong emotion. And this is the first source of sublime, that is inborn source. And the 3 other sources, that is appropriate use of figures, nobility of diction, dignity of composition, or a happy synthesis of all the preceding gifts, these 3 can be acquired by training, by practice, by education. So, this is what Longinus speaks about the sources of sublime. We can just consolidate this point and end this lecture. According to Longinus, there are 5 sources for sublimity, and they are grandeur of thought, capacity for strong emotion, appropriate use of figures, nobility of diction, dignity of composition, or a happy synthesis of all the preceding gifts. These are the 5 sources of sublimity. And these 5 sources of sublimity can be broadly divided into 2, that is inborn sources and acquirable sources. Inborn sources are grandeur of thought and capacity for strong emotion. Nobody can just inculcate great thoughts by training. Great thoughts come from great minds, great souls. Similarly, capacity for strong emotion again is in our biochemistry. That is, of course, in our body. It's in our genes. All right, and that too it is something that is conventional, that is heredity. Okay, so grandeur of thought and capacity for strong emotion is essential to become a great writer, or a great writer who can write something of sublimity. And the other 3 can be just acquired through practice, training, education, appropriate use of figures, nobility of diction, and dignity of composition. So with this we come to the end of lecture number 4, and in lecture number 5 we'll be discussing all these 5 sources in detail, and we will also go forward to chapter 9 of the treatise on the Sublime by Longinus. Thank you very much for listening.